And now we're going to move on to our scientific panel. So the first person that we have joining us is Dr. Wilson. He is Gomery's Chief Scientific Officer. He will then be followed by Dr. McKinney, Dr. Buskey, and Dr. Quigg. And I will introduce each of these as we go along. So I'm going to start with Dr. Wilson, and he's going to get our panel off and running. The only other thing I would like to mention is that we're running a little bit long, but hopefully we'll have time for a question or two for these four at the end of when they're all speaking. So if you do have a question, please type it into the chat box or the comment section on Facebook, and we will do our best to get that answered. So with that, I will stop sharing my screen so Jen can get up and running and introduce Dr. Wilson. Dr. Wilson serves as the Gomery Chief Scientific Officer, which provides scientific and research advice and leadership to Gomery. Dr. Wilson coordinates the work of the Gomery Research Board, the Gomery Administrative Unit, and the funded science projects to implement the research program. He is a distinguished scientist and academic leader, and has held numerous faculty and administrative posts at Louisiana State University, including former director of Louisiana Sea Grant. So with that, we'll introduce Dr. Wilson. Thank you.
Thank you, Danny. Can you hear me?
Loud and clear.
All right, great. Thank you very much. And delighted to be here. Like everyone else, I certainly want to thank this rock star group we call the Sea Grant team for organizing these events and certainly their participation over the past 8 years. As you heard from John, then Rita, then Laura, this has been an incredible partnership, and we think it's an incredible model for future endeavors like this. I certainly also want to thank the panelists that are going to follow me. They too have been great partners, and I wanted to comment that we have asked a great deal of all three of them. I don't think we're going to stop asking, but they've been critical in conducting and delivering Gomery science to the community. Apologies for not being on video. I am in Fairhope, Alabama. Hurricane Sally hit us pretty hard last week, and I just got power back this week, well, middle of this week, and still have no internet, but I know our friends in the path of Harvey clearly understand that. Next slide, please. I want to give you a brief perspective on federal investment in the Gulf region, and Larry McKinney and I and Laura have been talking about this. And this slide is an old slide. It came out of BOEM, we think. It shows the federal investment in three regions of the country. One is the Great Lakes, the Chesapeake Bay, and the Gulf of Mexico. And as you can see, the Gulf of Mexico, as we all know so well, has really lagged behind, given the size of the body of water that we are involved with, those other two important regions. And I stuck an arrow in to give you an idea of where annual Gomery funding began in 2010 for the Gulf of Mexico. So certainly one of our objectives is to try and continue that level of funding because we've learned it is so critical. So that's certainly a challenge to all of you and some of the speakers and panelists involved today. Next slide, Jen. Here's our footprint. As Rita reported, over the past 10 years, we've awarded some $420 million to research teams and consortia, both of which are represented in Texas. And this just gives you an idea of how expansive the networking that occurred as a result of Gomery investment, because a requirement was that research had to be focused on the Gulf of Mexico, and far and away all of our consortia are located in the Gulf of Mexico for the most part. And so it took this army of researchers from around the country and around the world to help conduct the kinds of research that I'll tell you a little bit about in a minute. So, and as you can see, we have quite a few teams in Texas. You've heard that already. All right, next slide, Jen, please. Or Danny, thank you. I'm going to walk through some of the research findings, and these are more or less organized by topics. It's impossible to capture all the science, and this changes almost every week with new science coming out, but we focused a lot of our research on transport. We learned a great deal about transport, but one of them related to the Mississippi River plume, which certainly affects the coast of Texas. And it created rapidly changing circulation patterns and fronts that influence the direction of the oil as it was coming on shore. It actually shielded some of Texas from the oil because of the way the plume was working at the time. But these frontal plumes can be expressed 40 to 50 miles offshore. The next figure down you've heard a lot about already. This is marine snow, a very important process that was documented by Dr. Quigg and her colleagues. One of the important parts that we want to make sure people understand is it played a significant role in transporting oil to the bottom, and we now understand that that could be as high as 10% of the oil was transported through this process, although there's some debates on that. Last figure, you've already heard Dr. Orbach talk about the micro droplets of oil that were cast up into the atmosphere from waves and rainfall droplets. What was critical about that was that these droplets were smaller than the hazmat gear filtration of many of the response workers, and we've really gotten the attention of the response community about what is the impact of those small oil droplets on respiratory distress. Next slide, please. Another very important area of investment by Gomery and a prevailing question that Sea Grant hears is what was the fate of the oil? What happened to it? And there have been a number of studies that have looked at that. I've already mentioned that currents had a lot to do with the movement of the oil. In fact, we found that oil was transported to the West Florida Shelf as a result of the subsea surface plume that was documented. We've also documented, and as Dr. Orbach alluded to, the footprint of carbon that is currently still in the Gulf of Mexico and will persist for years to come, and that follows the MOSFA process. And then the effect of dispersants, and many people were concerned about the fate of the hydrocarbon that came on shore, and our researchers documented that if dispersants were mixed into that oiled material that came on shore, it actually subsided farther into the sand. The good news is that hydrocarbon was rapidly degraded. Next topic, next slide, Annie. We talk a lot about dispersants, and there remains intense interest in the dispersant effects on Deepwater Horizon because subsea surface injection had never been done before, and so it happened during Deepwater Horizon. And so we frequently get the question, will you recommend it again? Too many scientific studies have been done to do it justice, but we've found that dispersant affected bacterial degradation, which is a very important part of the oil response process by the environment. The middle image was, we had a number of modeling studies that looked at the effect of dispersants. The oil will break down with and without dispersant, and we found examples of both. In some cases, it hindered as the oil degrading bacteria, and in other cases, there is evidence that it really wasn't needed. Another debate was, did it really serve its purpose? And this has been going on now for about 9 years. Initially, modeling indicated that it only marginally reduced surface oil, that's dispersants being injected at the site of the spill. More recently, they are documenting that the volatile organic carbons, the fumes, if you will, that you smell at a gas tank, were greatly reduced at the surface, which made it more a little safer for the response workers. Next topic, next slide. Biodegradation has been well documented across Gomery studies. We see evidence of microbial response in the marsh, on the coastal continental shelf, out in the water column, and in the deep ocean. And in all these cases, the microbial community rapidly expanded and responded to the presence of the oil. It began to degrade that oil, which was part of the natural oceanic response process in the Gulf of Mexico. And then that community returned to background levels. Maybe not exactly the same as it was before the spill, but it's a very important part of the process that we understand that degradation process as it relates to determining the impacts of the oil spill. Scientists have studied the effect of nitrogen on enhancing microbial degradation. Really a no-brainer to think you throw a little fertilizer on it. The bacteria does a better job because of the presence of nitrogen, which is critical in the microbial degradation process. What's interesting is there's not much nitrogen way down deep in the ocean where the spill originally occurred, which slowed the process of degradation down there because we're learning that there wasn't sufficient nutrients to support that degradation. And in addition, as it indicates in the bottom image, that high pressure also slows the growth and function of oil-degrading microbes in the deep ocean. Let's see, next slide. Marsh is actually a better story than many other stories you'll hear in some cases. We had an army of researchers in Louisiana and Alabama working in the wetlands because that's where people saw the oil coming on shore. I'm sure many of you saw the disheartening images of our seabirds and marshes covered in oil at the time of the spill. And as I mentioned, turns out to be some good news and bad news. Where the oil came on shore in Louisiana, there was fairly rapid recovery of the marsh. 1.5 years after the spill came on shore, they were in the process of recovering, and 4 or 5 years after the spill, some of that marsh area was fully recovered. The exception to that is that where the oil was thick enough that it killed the vegetation, it led to loss of the root structure, and it caused accelerated erosion of those areas in coastal Louisiana. A common coastal inhabitant in the marsh areas are dolphins. I'm sure many of you are familiar with them. This is a sad story. There was early signs of reproductive failure by a lot of the cohorts. Dolphins lived to be 70 or 80 years old, and they documented that only 20% of the pregnancies were successful in coastal Louisiana, compared to 80% in reference populations in Florida and California. Dolphins were also unable to avoid oil fume and oil exposure as they were breathing, and you know how dolphins breathe. And so they've documented conditions like COPD and emphysema in some of the dolphin populations that are studied in coastal Louisiana. So that group will continue to study that because that's a long-term recovery process, and it's likely that those who are impacted will never recover. We also documented decades-long persistence of harmful hydrocarbons in the marshes. When the oil came on shore, it went down the holes of crabs and burrowers, got down into the anaerobic zone, and you can still today go stick a shovel in some of the marshes of Louisiana and detect and measure and smell that oil. As the marshes erode away, that oil will be exposed, and it causes re-oiling events. Next slide, Danny, please. We have a number of studies in the deepwater communities. Some of these are absolutely fascinating. The one I think is most intriguing is the mesopelagic community. This is a very poorly understood community in the deep waters of the Gulf and most oceans. It's called mesopelagic, and it's made up of crustaceans, large plankton, young fish, and some adult fish like this anglerfish you see a picture of. They're very interesting photographically. Around the oil site, the number of these organisms declined precipitously following the spill, and they have yet to recover. Now, we don't know much about it, but what we do know is they're critical prey items for things like migratory whales. So we're trying to thread together what the consequences of that population reduction. Fortunately, that team has continued to be funded under some of the penalty money and NERDA fine money, and so that story will continue. Also down in the deep ocean, not far from the spill, we have this really unique community of soft corals. These corals are really interesting looking. They're inhabited by a number of organisms, including some echinoderms. And it was evident where the spill occurred, they were beginning to die back. We had branch loss. These corals have been documented to be 800 years old, so where they were damaged, we're looking at a very large recovery period. And finally, another note on bacteria in deep ocean. We did document the response of a bacterial community that actually eat methane. Now, you know methane is a gas, but it was dissolved in water, and these microbes can actually assimilate methane and help accelerate its decomposition. I think this is the last slide on results. Number of food web studies. Again, the question is, how does the oil get into the food web and what happens to it? This relates to early concerns that Sea Grant helped us field about seafood safety. We heard, as a Sea Grant director, we heard immediately, is the seafood safe to eat? Scientists found that phytoplankton abundance was initially impacted and dropped way off in 2010. That affected the food web. We found, as Dr. Orbach had mentioned, that coastal marine animals actually assimilated carbon from Deepwater Horizon, both by ingesting bacteria that were enriched with oil carbon, and also by eating zooplankton that had previously grazed on oil. And then the effect on deep sea fishes. We're still getting information about that, but tilefish is a common commercial species out in the deep water of the Gulf. They live in burrows. Those burrows are lined with oiled marine snow, and so being in contact with that oiled marine snow that's now in the sediment, they're still assimilating oil carbon into their system, and we find indications of oil contamination in their livers and gallbladders. That's a quick synopsis of our research findings, and they're very abundant. I certainly recommend you go to our website if you'd like to see more of the really interesting stories. One of the things I wanted to comment on is the collaborative science community around Gomery. It really has been fascinating and a joy to watch this evolve, and it's going to be one of the long-term, long-lasting beneficial aspects of the Gomery program. And there have been a number of spills since Deepwater Horizon, and we had an armed group ready to respond. Hercules gas blowout happened in the mid-Gulf about 2015, and Gomery scientists responded immediately. Similarly, there was an oil spill in Galveston Bay, and Dr. Quigg and her team were able to respond to that. And researchers made comments such as having Gomery scientists on speed dial created an efficient response network. And Dr. Quigg even said that all the researchers who responded commented that on her team into the Galveston spill as being part of a larger, well-funded science community enabled them to learn a lot more than they would have otherwise. And we had other community-related interactions with all of our researchers. We had a hydrocarbon calibration experiment that challenged how well our researchers were measuring hydrocarbons using various techniques. You've already heard about marine oil snow. Dr. Quigg has had a lot to do with that, and we've had dispersant discussions. So those are just examples of the kind of collaborative activity we've had. Next slide. You've heard a lot about these already, but what is the Gomery legacy? And Rita commented on this. Certainly the impressive amount of research funding that has gone into the Gulf region has elevated our state of knowledge way beyond where it would have been had that not happened. Not a good thing, not a bad thing. You've heard about networks between all the scientists, the wonderful graduate students, the conference series that we look forward to Laura and Larry leading the continuation of, and the massive contribution to the scientific literature, which Rita highlighted. Finally, and Rita mentioned this, last slide, Danny, is we are now conducting this comprehensive synthesis work. Rita mentioned that. All three of our panelists are involved in our synthesis, as are all of our researchers. And this is a very important part, which we didn't forecast at the beginning of Gomery, but we got involved in 2 years ago. So please stay tuned. Look for Sea Grant presentations over the next 2 or 3 years that will relay those findings. And with that, I'll stop. Thank you, Danny.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Chuck. Up next is Dr. McKinney. Dr. McKinney is the recently retired director of the Heart Research Institute for the Gulf of Mexico Studies and is currently the chair of Gulf Strategies at Texas A&M University Corpus Christi. Prior to working at HRI, he was the director of aquatic resources with the Texas Parks and Wildlife Service. And in that position, Dr. McKinney was involved in various activities, working towards water quality and conservation in Texas, establishing sustainable fisheries in the Gulf and surrounding waters, and guiding Seagrass Task Force monitoring the health and status of Texas bays and estuaries and performing other general resource protection.
Thank you, Danny. I appreciate it. And while she's putting that up, I'm very happy to hear from Chuck that he has electricity again down there. I know how important that is. If you live on the Gulf Coast after hurricanes, the most important thing could happen pretty much is getting your electricity back. So glad to hear that, Chuck. And I appreciate Chuck's introduction. It really makes my presentation more focused and directed to where we're heading. And I want to talk a little bit about the trajectory of Gulf research, and you got that wonderful perspective from all of our previous speakers of what Gomery has achieved, and I want to talk a little bit about that. So if you can go to the next slide, Danny, please. And I think I want to put a little context in first. Why are we even concerned about this? What's the fuss? And I'll just make a quick slide case of why the Gulf of Mexico is so important, and the fact that a resilient Gulf of Mexico is important, because it really is a keystone resource, aquatic resource for the North America and the USA. Trapped as it is between the east and west coasts and underlying the huge infrastructure remainder of the country, it provides a really important economic and ecological functions. It kind of outlines here. And if you hit the next slide, next please. The goal, of course, is how do you keep all this in balance to make sure that the Gulf continues to produce all of the ecosystem services and economics that we count on, yet staying healthy and productive itself. Next. And maintaining that balance requires a sustained Gulf of Mexico research. Gomery has set a really high standard, has put a bar, raised the bar considerably about what we need. And we need to continue that now that Gomery is winding down to its conclusion. And that's what I want to focus on a bit. And not everyone believes that. Back in after the spill in 2011, as we were going through a lot of analysis and trying to understand this, I had the chance to have a discussion with the leader of a well-known major American foundation. I won't give the name particularly, but if you want to know it, give me a call and I'll tell you. And they made this statement directly to me that the Gulf is an industrial sea, is not worth the investment from their perspective. So we're going to go where we have an impact. And that was a kind of a stunning statement, but not one that was unusual for the time because of what some people believed about the Gulf and didn't know about it. Next, please. And that extended, frankly, to the federal government. Chuck had this slide up here. This was a slide, by the way, that I got from contacting EPA back in 2011, right after the spill, and it really is it's a focus of I think it's an example of federal spending. This is EPA dollars, and they were the ones who were able to give me the data, were willing to do it. They quickly pulled that off their website after it kind of got well known, but this is the point that Chuck has made, that the Gulf never got the amount of attention that any other area like Chesapeake Bay, that small little dot up there in the upper right of your slide compared to the Gulf of Mexico. The Gulf never got that attention and funding from the research side of things from any of the agencies. And that's reflected in the productivity and the reports and studies and peer-reviewed articles about the Gulf. And I put this together just to kind of make that point of looking at the attention paid to the Gulf until about 1990, and really back in 1973, and I was trying to discern what began the upward climb of that. Next, please. And really what it amounts to is the times that we pay attention to the Gulf of Mexico was with the Arab oil embargo and the Gulf War. So in times of crisis, particularly related around oil, then the Gulf gets the attention it needs, otherwise no. And that's with the exception of one federal agency, and I want to give an appropriate shout out to the Minerals Management Service, or now BOEM, because they started in 1973 looking at the Gulf and expending funds there in research. And so from 1973 to 2010, they invested over $1 billion in the Gulf of Mexico, producing some 1,800 projects and 3,600 reports that are reflected here. And then, of course, that ignorance, our lack of understanding of the Gulf of Mexico, our ignorance of the Gulf was really laid bare, starting with the tragic incident, as Rita mentioned, with the loss of lives and the environmental impact of Deepwater Horizon. And then we really realized we didn't know enough about the Gulf of Mexico to protect it or restore it. And so this was, which I greatly appreciate, the BP's launch of the program and Rita's leadership and the board and all that has been done by Gomery to respond to that. And so you've heard from Chuck's summary in particular, which I think was really well done in a very short time of all the work that Gomery researchers have done, launched in the program and really began to turn around our understanding of the Gulf of Mexico and how it works and so forth. That brings me to the point I wanted to talk about at this point is one of the aspects of Gomery that both Rita, which I appreciate, alluded to, and Chuck did as well, about the Grid C group and what we're talking about there. And I had the opportunity when the program for coming together, Gomery program is coming together, to have some input on areas that ought to be looked at. And this was one of them, that making sure that what was learned over that 10-year period and $500 million was not lost. And in that, I had a couple of mentors. that really helped me solidify what I knew already. Because I spent about half my career, as was noted, with Parks and Wildlife, and I helped establish the NERDA program in Texas. Was the first designated natural resource trustee in the state, and led the Parks and Wildlife response to oil spills over that period of time. And so I was acutely aware of what we didn't know about how to respond and recover from those oil spills. But what really reinforced that for me here at HRI were two individuals. The first, Wes Tunnell, who of course is now passed, unfortunately. But Wes led the research for NOAA on Ixtoc spill at the time. And then Jim Jabot, who you're going to hear from in a moment. Jim was very much involved in the Exxon Valdez spill as well, and so they also understood this issue of not losing what we might have learned in regards to these spills. And if you'll hit next, please. And what we found out is from Ixtoc, we learned almost nothing. As soon as the Mexican government and PMEX really was not interested in letting much information out about that spill, it might be understandable. And as soon as it was stopped, as soon as the spill was brought to an end, all research into there, and we really didn't have much coming out of that. Dr. Tunnell collected most of those research papers, and there were total only 58 that we could discover. Exxon Valdez, they did a much better job. In fact, I know Gomery worked very closely with the research board there to learn some lessons there, and they did and still are active in that regard of trying to make sure. But nonetheless, there, as Dr. Jabot has told me on a couple of occasions, that he's been contacted by researchers trying to find data that has been lost and sitting in someone's file cabinet or on a floppy disk or something like that type of thing. So we were determined to not let that happen with Gomery and the work that we did here. And that was the genesis of GRID-C, which is the single greatest collaboration of Gulf scientists ever. And this is the numbers where it is today off the website, and it grows, frankly, almost every day. So and I'm not going to say much more about that. Rita gave a wonderful summary of it, and Dr. Jabot is going to talk more about it. So I just want to make the point that this, I think, is one of the long-term legacies, one of the most significant accomplishments of Gomery, other than the actual research work that they did themselves, just to make sure that nothing that the Gomery researchers have discovered will be accessible, and it is. And you can find anything from peer-reviewed papers to reports and data. That information will be available to scientists and managers and policymakers, hopefully forever, but certainly for a substantial period of time. And so I think that's going to be a great legacy of Gomery, to make sure that what we have learned is carried forward. And I can't say that will be the case for other research programs going forward. I hope it is. We're certainly working with them to try to make sure it is. I think they're committed that way, and I'm hoping that they will follow Gomery's lead in making sure that what we learned over this period of time, the greatest intensive research focus on the Gulf of Mexico ever, we've learned more about the Gulf of Mexico in the last 10 years than in all the time before that. Hopefully that all of that going forward will be available for future scientists. And so that's what I want to, and I'll be working on even in retirement, is to make sure that we have an active and focused and sustained research enterprise going well beyond Gomery. Gomery has made the model. They've set a high standard. They raised the bar for doing this. We need to make sure that happens as we go forward. Right now, the research programs that are following up and beginning to get their feet under them after being in place for 5 years, they have something to look at, to aspire to. And we're not there yet with any of those programs, but the model that Gomery has set will be key in guiding that in the future. And so I just want to thank Rita, the board, Chuck, Mike Karen, all of the researchers that were part of Gomery, for what they've done for the future of the Gulf of Mexico to make sure it is healthy and sustainable. So I appreciate the opportunity to make this brief presentation.
Thank you very much. We appreciate that. Next, we will hear from Dr. Buskey. Dr. Buskey is the director of the Gomery Drops Consortium, so dispersion research on oil, physics, and plankton studies. He joined the University of Texas Marine Science Institute in 1986 as a research scientist and was promoted to professor in 1999. His research interests in marine science have focused on studies of the behavioral ecology of marine zooplankton and how sensory perception mediates behavioral adaptations for local food resources, avoiding predators and finding mates. Much of this research makes use of video microcinematography and automated video computer methods for imaging and motion analysis. And I'll let him talk a little bit more about that.
Thank you for the introduction, Danny. As has been mentioned, so I had the privilege of being the director of the DROPS Consortium, which is dispersion research on oil, physics, and plankton studies. And so again, I'm just going to talk to you today about just a couple of highlights from that. There was an awful lot of different findings we had within this project, but I'll just take the time to highlight just a couple of those. So anyway, just four things I want to mention recently. I'll mention some studies where we developed a method to better predict the amount of oil that was coming out of a damaged well, basically to be able to look at the relative proportions of oil and water in a plume coming out of a damaged well on the bottom of the ocean through some laboratory studies. We also, as I think has been previously mentioned, we also had built a number of different wave tanks and looked at various physical processes to see how waves and raindrops and other bubbles and things like that, how they would break up particularly dispersant treated oil and break it up into small particles, some of which go in the atmosphere and some of which would be distributed in the water column, and how that affected human beings as well as potentially as wildlife. And then also these small droplets that are in the water column were the same size range essentially as the food of a lot of zooplankton. And so I'll mention show some examples of how those were actually directly ingested by organisms at the base of the food web. And then finally, just, marine food webs are very complex. And so the fact we did a number of studies looking at the lethal and sublethal effects of oil on these organisms, and we found that there's a lot of difference in the degree of response to them. So we also did some microcosm experiments just to see how this might alter the structure of marine food webs. So again, is this picture in the center here is a picture of the Deepwater Horizon plume. And so there's a real challenge to try to figure out how much oil is in that, because the oil is opaque and it's a very dense cloud of oil droplets. And so it's really hard to know what proportion of oil and water are in that. And this is important for just trying to know the total amount of oil that's being released into the environment. So scientists in our group developed a method where they used a transparent oil and a transparent water solution that had the same refractive index. So when we passed light through it, it wouldn't distort the images. And these fluids also had the exact same properties, physical properties, as crude oil and seawater. And so then, as you can see in this lower image of our setup, we put a laser sheet through there and we're able to create a plume in the laboratory and then look at that in detail. So we put fluorescent dye in the oil. So the oil is the white substance that you see, and the water is dark in the background. And so if you look at that last bottom figure over on the right-hand side, you can see these droplets. And we were surprised to find that they were quite a bit more complex in their composition than we expected. Next slide, please. So these are close-ups of these, and you can see these droplets are much more complex. So within oil droplets, there were additional water droplets and sometimes additional oil droplets within that. And so again, depending upon the physical properties of the way that oil was coming out of the leak and how that plume was formed, depending upon Reynolds numbers and shear and that sort of thing, would depend on how these oil droplets formed. And so again, this allows a better, not only empirical data on this process, but also a better theoretical understanding. And again, it's important to understand in these plumes how much oil there is, and also by having water in these droplets, it also affects the buoyancy of these droplets, and it will determine how quickly they're going up to the surface. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned, we also built a number of wave tanks to try to look at the breakup of oil. You can see again on the right-hand side here a number of frames from high-speed videos. So we would put a small circle of oil on the surface of the water and create waves. And some of that wave, and particularly with the dispersant treated oil, that oil would be broken up into very small droplets, some of which would be distributed into the water. But we also discovered that a number of these were also very small droplets were being splashed up into the atmosphere as well, up into the air. And so we decided to look at that in a little bit more detail. So we're very concerned about this. Again, from a number of different sources, we found that these, particularly with dispersant treated oil, that very small oil droplets were being spread up into the atmosphere. And so these marine oil aerosols, we developed, some scientists that are a member of our consortium at the Johns Hopkins School of Public Health were looking at, basically had human lung epithelial cell cultures that they could use. And this setup that's shown in the middle here, basically we would add the oily aerosols to this chamber, and then we had a high-speed video system that could then actually record the movements of the cilia on the lung epithelial cells. So we could dose it with this oily aerosol and immediately see the response of these cilia, which are normally involved in sort of clearing out particles out of the lungs. And they also were able to do longer-term experiments to look at the overall impact of these oily aerosols. And then we're also very interested in trying to understand, the small oil droplets that are spread into the ocean, try to understand what impact that had on the base of the marine food web, which would be made up of phytoplankton and zooplankton. And again, so the image on the left here shows sort of the complexity of a typical marine food web. And then on the right-hand side, it just shows it more as a food chain with all the different groups of organisms that would make that up. And so I'm going to show you two examples, one from the microzooplankton, which is circled, and then from the mesozooplankton, that shows that these organisms are actually directly ingesting these oil droplets as well from these small oil droplets that are produced when you have dispersed oil. So in addition to being exposed to the dissolved toxins that crude oil leaves in the water, they also were directly ingesting these. So this just shows some examples of protozoa here. So we have heterotrophic dinoflagellates in these slides. And so, for example, you can see in image B and then the image C next to it. So image B, you can see some dark globules in the food vacuoles of these protozoa, but you really don't know whether they're oil or not. When you expose it to UV light under the microscope, crude oil glows, fluoresces under UV light. So you can see those white spots, so that shows which ones of those are actually crude oil. And similarly, you can see that for another species in E and F. So again, these organisms, even these small single-celled organisms, were directly ingesting some of these small oil droplets. And then larger zooplankton, like these copepods, were also ingesting these small oil droplets. And again, you can see in the series of figures on the right-hand side here, 3 different species of copepods. And again, these oil droplets are, again, in the similar size range as the phytoplankton food and the protozoa that they normally feed on. And again, in the right-hand panels, you can see where under fluorescent light that you can actually see some of these small oil droplets within their digestive systems. And then on the bottom panel, you can see, I'm sure all of you are curious about this, but on the left-hand side, you can see a copepod fecal pellet. So again, these are the waste materials that they produce when they're feeding. And it looks like there's small oil droplets on there. And again, if you look on the right-hand side under fluorescent microscopy, you can in fact confirm that there are numerous small oil droplets within these fecal pellets. These fecal pellets sink, and this is another source of getting some of this oil back down to the bottom of the ocean, similar to the MOFSA that Antoinetta will talk about. And then finally, just to look at another example, we actually, again, we went out and did some experiments where we took natural assemblages of planktonic organisms and exposed them to oil. And again, we found that, again, because some of these were more sensitive to oil than others, it actually changed the structure of the marine food web. So in this case, and this actually is corroborated by some of the studies we did in the laboratory on single species, but we generally found that things like tintinids and ciliates, which are the 2 organisms on the left-hand side there, which are normally grazers on phytoplankton, these were among the most sensitive protozoa in the water column to oil. And so these charts are just showing you how the population numbers decline with increasing exposure to either crude oil alone, or in the bottom panels, dispersed crude oil. And again, now you see in the next two panels next to that, where it's marked autotrophic, mixotrophic dinoflagellates and heterotrophic dinoflagellates, that at the same time, these organisms were increasing in abundance as oil concentration increased. So it's not that the oil makes them grow faster, it's that they're being released from their predators, from their grazers, who are more affected by the soil. So again, you can see that this kind of have an effect on the food web structure. And again, it seems that, for example, that it can actually lead to the formation of blooms of dinoflagellates, which are sometimes referred to as red tides. So again, and a number of red tides have been reported in association with following oil spills. And then finally, this and a lot of other elements that we did were put together. We worked with a group called Sintef in Norway, which has this model called OSCAR, Oil Spill Contingency and Response. And so basically, a lot of the empirical data we received about how the oil is breaking up and creation of the aerosols and the impacts on different organisms were entered into this to improve models to try to help responding organizations know exactly what the impacts of dispersal applications and other strategies to deal with oil spills, what's further understand where the oil is going to end up and what impact it's going to have on the environment. Anyway, and again, so just to reiterate, so again, the research that we did in this consortium then greatly helped us with our overall understanding of how oil behaves in the environment and how it impacts the food web in the Gulf. And again, this was mostly done in laboratory type experiments, and then also then to try to inform the model to help responders. And also I'd like to point out that, again, we worked with a great group of engineers in here and used a lot of advanced optical techniques, and other new technologies were developed, and they were shared across disciplines. So we helped train biologists, chemists with some of these advanced techniques that were developed by the engineers in our consortium. Then finally, as has already been mentioned, a lot of new scientists were trained. So we had a lot of graduate students, postdocs, who are already becoming the future professors and research scientists that are well equipped to deal with future oil spills.
Excellent. Thank you very much. We appreciate it. If anyone has any questions for our last three speakers and upcoming Dr. Quigg, please write it in the chat. If not, we will just sort of continue with our program, and that's not a problem at all. So up next, we have Dr. Quigg. Dr. Quigg is a research scientist of the Gomery Adamex Consortium and Senior Associate Vice President for Research and Graduate Students. She's located at Texas A&M University, Galveston. So Adamex investigates the impact of spilled oil and dispersants of the formation of an extracellular matrix formed by marine microbes that is thought to be instrumental in determining the fate of oil. This formation by marine microbes can aid in the formation of marine snow that is important in the self-cleansing capacity of natural waters. And I'll let her tell you a little bit more about that.
Thank you, Danny, and thank you to the previous presenters for setting the stage for a lot of the pieces of the talk that I'm going to give you today. And I've taken a slightly different tact in my presentation, and we'll focus a little bit less on the science and a little bit more on the people and the work that we did. So Danny, when you're ready to start, please start. And so thank you to Chuck, Rita, Ray, and all the others for setting a wonderful stage and for establishing a wonderful program. And I feel really privileged to be one of the consortia leaders. And I call it a privilege because it's given me amazing opportunities, not only to do some fabulous science, but to work with amazing people across the Gulf and around the world. And I really have valued that experience. The consortia that I was able to lead was the Adamex Consortium, and we looked at the aggregation and degradation of dispersants and oil by microbial exopolymers. And unlike a lot of the other consortia, we were interested very much in what the microbial community was doing. And this premise that microbes play an important role in oil spill cleanup. So as has mentioned earlier, the Deepwater Horizon was a tragic accident that killed 10 lives, injured 17 folks, and possibly numerous more, and created many, many hardships for the people that live and work in the Gulf of Mexico. But it also created an amazing opportunity. And so on the left-hand part of the screen, you see the days after the spill as the fire was being put out, as the oil was being herded, and dispersants and other mechanisms were being used to contain the oil spill and the consequences of the spill. And if you look on the right-hand side, this is a schematic of the microbial community in a clean, happy ocean. And in that scenario, they're photosynthesizing and producing food for higher parts of the food web. It's an important mechanism for the drawdown of carbon dioxide into the ocean. Phytoplankton in particular form the base of the food web for zooplankton, which is what Ed studies, and other higher trophic levels. And in their normal day-to-day, when they're doing business, they're very good at producing marine snow. And this marine snow material here, you've got an image of a variety of phytoplankton and even some zooplankton. And in their day-to-day, they release exopolymers. And these polymers are released in what we believe is a strategy to protect themselves from oil, but other kinds of pollutants that occur in the marine environment. And I often liken this material to the exopolymers that we as humans produce when we have colds and flus or allergies. And so these are very inexpensive for the microbes to produce, and they can produce them in vast quantities. And as a result of their production, we find that the pollutants will attach or be glued onto the microbes and eventually sink to the bottom of the ocean. Next, please, Danny. And so as a result of this natural process, when we have an oil spill, what we now know is that oil can become trapped in this marine snow material. And the schematic on the right shows you what we think may be going on. And the process as a whole was studied very, very well as part of the GoMRI effort. And we thank the board for their support of that. And MOSFA, which you've heard several times this morning, is marine oil snow sedimentation and flocculent accumulation. So really understanding how oil alters the pathway of this marine snow material to the sediment. And what are the consequences of that, both for the oil and the microbial communities. For the oil, we know that up to 30% of the oil was returned to the sediments, possibly by this process. The estimates vary from 5 to 30%, but we know this was an important mechanism. And through the efforts of those interested or those that participated in the Ixtoc oil spill, we now know that MOSFA also occurred in that oil spill. So there's an argument that this was not just important for the Deepwater Horizon, but also possibly for other oil spills going on. What I really wanted to talk more about, if you want to know more about the science, please reach out to me. Please look on our website. But what I really wanted to spend the rest of the talk talking about was the impact of the GoMRI program on Texas and on science in general. So the Adamex Consortium was made up of a number of universities, and their logos are shown below. And you've seen slides that show you that GoMRI funded researchers all over the country as well as other countries. And so just in Texas alone, the number of faculty, staff, students that were involved in the GoMRI program had a huge and definitely beneficial impact on the state of Texas. Next, please, Danny. Next, two, please. So this is a photo of our little group. And I say little group because I know we were one of the smaller consortia. And if you can see the box on the top right-hand corner, it shows you that over the 5-year period, there were more than 100 people involved in our project. And I'm really, really proud of that. And especially the I want to say the range of ages involved. So if you look on the left-hand corner, you'll see Peter Sanchi, who's going to turn 80 next year. And if you look at the bottom front row, you see some high school students that are now doing their undergraduate degrees, and everyone in between. We were able to support an amazing number of graduate students and postdocs with this program. 19 postdocs that are now either research scientists or professors at universities and all sorts of other things. I'm also really, really proud that we were able to support so many undergraduate students. You'll see that at last count, we had supported 48 students with the program in just a period of 5 years. We're also able to support a large number of high school students, and some of those high schoolers are pursuing careers in environmental chemistry. Next, please, Danny. And just following along with that theme of training the next generation, Danny, if you just want to click through the next few figures, that would be fabulous. These are just some of the faces on the team. Some of these folks, one more click. Some of these folks are still in Texas. Some of these folks have moved elsewhere. But you can see that, again, we trained an amazing cross-generation of people as part of the Adamex project. And these folks are now in academia. They're now working in nonprofits. They're now pursuing careers in industry. And the one thing that I feel that GoMRI enabled us to do, which no other funding opportunity has allowed us to do previously, and I hope we may have the opportunity again in the future, was to be able to bring in a huge amount of talent and have them work together side by side. There's some images on the left-hand screen where you have biologists with engineers and chemists with modelers and high school students with senior professors and just an amazing plethora of people that in a very, very short period of time came together to solve really, really important and complex questions. And as this generation moves forward in their careers, they've all had an amazing and unique opportunity to work on a really, really complicated project and do some wonderful science. And for those that are now in industry or now in nonprofits, I hope that they take those lessons learned and apply them as they go forward into the future. And I hope that those people in particular create bridges and networks for future scientific endeavors. So next, please, Danny. And along those terms, I really wanted to talk about the outreach and education that we were able to do through community engagement. And I'd really like to thank Sea Grant for their support in facilitating a lot of the activities that we were able to do. And, you know, I've got an image, which hopefully you guys can see on the left there, of just some of the fun activities that we had. We were able to work with scout groups. We were able to participate in annual events like World Ocean Day and Earth Day, the Science Olympiad, and various other activities. We were able to bring what we were doing to various academies like the Texas Academy of Science. We were able to work through with K through 12 and even teacher training events. And those teacher training events are particularly impactful because we know that those teachers are going to be training the next generation of students for many, many years to come, and that oil spills and the response of the microbial community is now going to be part of those conversations. And with the help of Sea Grant in particular, we were able to share what we were doing in workshops with first responders, with folks at state and federal agencies, with local incident command team groups. And as you might imagine, you know, for folks working with what I like to call the charismatic megafauna, you know, the turtles, the dolphins, the fish, you know, everybody is interested in those kinds of things. Everybody connects to those kinds of things very, very easily. But the microbes are tough. It's much more difficult to get in community engagement when you're talking about microbes. But I think as a result of the work that we did with the support of GoMRI, the outreach efforts we were able to do with the support of Sea Grant, we have now introduced a whole generation of folks to microbes, phytoplankton in particular, and their importance in food webs, their importance in being part of nature's system for cleaning up after an oil spill. And I thank Chuck for his unwavering support over the years, and everyone else on the board and Sea Grant as well. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you very much,